invitation and really glad to be here. Sorry I was kind of roaming around and she introduced me. I was looking for a water. So I knew that I would get dehydrated. I hear that you had a speaker, Seth Ehorn, pretty recently, who's my colleague at Houston Christian. I teach, so there might be a bit of overlap. I didn't intend that. But I think will be different enough in that I think he was giving you kind of an introduction to Second Temple Judaism. And I designed my talk to be more of a common tropes that people commit, particularly with respect to anti-Judaism or anti-Semitism when they're reading the New Testament or the Bible as a whole. And so I thought I would just name a few of these tropes and then give you, I think, the errors that they commit and then what you might do instead. And my goal is you'll have a hard stop at 8 is what I heard. So I'm going to go through these and then leave plenty of time for discussion because I think that's probably going to flesh out a lot of the stuff I say so that I won't say everything in my own sort of lecture or talk time, but that any sort of discussion can be brought out through that. So I'll follow this handout pretty straightforwardly and flesh it out as we go. So I suspect, I'm curious to hear at the end how many of these tropes you'll have heard or have maybe even committed, but I won't hold you guilty for it. False trope number one. So that's how you have to read them. I actually had to add the words false trope number one because as I wrote the handout, I just wrote Jews are legalistic. And then I remember thinking no, that's the false trope. So I had to add, these are the false things that you ought not say. It feels wordy, that's the reason. One of the false tropes I think people commit is claiming that the Old Testament taught legalism or works righteousness or the notion that Jews or Israelites were earning their salvation by their law keeping. I think this is wrong. I don't think the Old Testament or New Testament teaches this. And I don't think that any New Testament author, Jesus, Paul, or the authors of any documents, critique the Jews for this. So to be clear, I think the New Testament authors think legalism is wrong. I just don't think they ever thought that other Jews held that position, so that they weren't ever critiquing it. So the notion that the Old Testament taught legalism or the fact that you had to earn your salvation, I think the error this commits is that it assumes that the law functioned in a non-covenantal relationship, in which that Israel was simply given the law and then do it as best you can. Let's see how it works out for you, right? So that if Israel receives the law in a non-covenantal relationship, that permits you then to think that, okay, here's the law, you got to obey it to be part of God's people, so transgressions are kind of function like demerits, and they go over here in this balance. And that starts to weigh you down, so you need to outbalance that with acts of obedience. And so without a covenantal relationship that contextualizes law keeping, you end up with transgressions weigh you down, so you need to outweigh that with acts of obedience. I think the error that I think may be obvious by the way I framed it, the error in this construal or in this context is that it ignores the covenantal relationship within which God had given this law. In other words, the Old Testament depicts, and the New Testament as well, depicts the law as the stipulations that God gave to Israel by which they would express their allegiance to him, but that it assumed, the covenantal arrangement assumed, that Israel would commit transgressions. Right? The commission of transgressions does not thereby break the covenant. The commission of transgressions does not remove a person from the covenant because the commission of transgressions was an assumed aspect of the covenantal relationship. Just like in marriage or long-term relationships, in which you don't assume the person will be sinless. You assume they won't be unfaithful to you. That's a vow. But within a long-term relationship, whether it's marriage or your job or a long-term friendship, you don't assume the person will be sinless. You assume that the nature of your relationship can accommodate the commission of errors or transgressions on the other person's part without defeating the relationship. That's basically what the relationship is here in Israel's relationship with God, and that's how the law operates within it. The obvious antidote to this error is to realize that, as I wrote there in 1c, that the law did operate within this covenantal agreement, in which God had prescribed means for forgiveness and grace, namely the sacrificial system. Right? So the sacrificial system itself is the antidote to this erroneous view and the antidote to transgressions. Israel commits transgressions, and they can rely upon, in a non-pejorative sense, they can rely upon God's grace to interact with them and meet them. He does not assume that they're sinless. In fact, it's quite the opposite, right? The texts name God's awareness of their rebellion. He says, look, I've been with you guys since Egypt, and you've been rebellious since I brought you out of Egypt. So if this is going to work, right, this is how it's going to work. And so he gives them laws by which they regulate their life together, horizontally, and with God. Okay, so I'm going to go through these, and then we'll talk about them at the end. If you have a question, please write it down, and we'll have plenty of time to talk about it. The trope number 2 that is a bit more subtle, because it seems like such an obvious reading of particularly the prophetic passages, but I think it's subtly wrong and all the more egregiously wrong. The false trope is that there's a sort of a prophet versus priest reading of the Old Testament. So you'll have read Old Testament passages, particularly in the prophetic material, where a prophet will critique rituals or critique sacrifice and instead say, look, what God really wants is justice, mercy, etc. This is actually participating in, to name one of the words in our lecture series, how to read the Bible in a way that isn't anti-Semitic. This is actually participating in an anti-Semitic approach to the biblical text itself, made famous actually in the late 1800s and the early 1900s in Germany, where the prophets were held to be these moral exemplars that exemplified Israel's moral ideals. And they critiqued, these prophets supposedly critiqued ritual or sacrifice or any sort of priestly regulations. Once you've got that framework, it seems it's really easy to think that, oh, there's this ideal that God wants that the prophets sort of exemplify, which is morals, ethics, justice, and mercy. And there's this ideal that the priests want, which is rituals and sacrifice. And once you've got that prophet versus priest motif or trope, it commits you to reading a lot of ritual texts, like Leviticus, where God himself is the one who prescribes all these rituals, and you just are left basically confused. You think like, wait, if the prophets say don't sacrifice, and yet God is the one who prescribed the sacrifices, how do you read these texts together? And also, how do you read them in a way that doesn't commit you to saying that God doesn't actually care about all these other things that Jews seem to care about, like rituals and sacrifices? The error, now you can look at the handout, the error I think this makes is that it mistakes the prophetic critique of sacrifice as if it were a wholesale critique of sacrifice or ritual, when actually the prophets were critiquing the performance of sacrifice for egregious sins for which there was no sacrifice, or for their thinking that sacrifice would just mend the broken covenant. In other words, there are sins for which there's no sacrificial remedy. So if you commit murder, there's no sacrificial remedy for that. The law itself says, look, if you commit murder, you can receive divine forgiveness and divine mercy, but not because you brought a sacrifice. Same deal with Leviticus's named prohibitions of certain sexual acts. The Bible isn't saying that you can't receive forgiveness or grace or mercy for these things. It's saying there's no sacrificial remedy for them. If you commit these acts, the only remedy is either the punishment of the person who did it, or the repentance of the person who did it and just throwing himself or herself upon God's mercy, or exile. But according to the law, there's no sacrificial remedy for these sins. And the prophets, agreeing with the law, say, look, you guys are, right? How does Isaiah say it? Your hands are full of blood. In other words, you've committed precisely the kinds of errors for which there's no sacrificial remedy. So don't bring sacrifices thinking that it will get you out of the mess. So in other words, the prophetic critique of sacrifice has nothing to do with an anti-ritual or an anti-sacrifice conviction. It has to do with the fact that the prophets believe Israel has committed the kind of sins for which there's no sacrificial remedy. So stop bringing the sacrifices and instead do what God wants you to do, namely love, justice, mercy, etc. Once you get that, if you have that prophet versus priest motif and you think it's sort of just like how the Bible works, it's really easy to accidentally slip into applying that to Jesus and Paul, such that then Jesus is simply carrying on the ideal of the prophets and is himself also anti-ritual. The reason this is wrong, in my opinion, is that Jesus is descriptively and frequently pro-ritual. He tells the leper he cleanses in Mark 1, right? After he cleanses the leper, he says, now go and give the offering for your cleansing as Moses required, right? And he talks about the necessary purification rituals that people ought to do. So it seems that the Gospels depict Jesus as not anti-ritual or anti-sacrifice. Or in Matthew 5, if someone has something against you, and you're making an offering, and then you remember there at the altar that someone has something against you, what should you do? It says, leave your offering there and go reconcile with that person, and then go make your offering. That's right. He assumes the givenness of making offerings, not anti-ritual or anti-sacrifice. And the irony of this depiction that depicts Jesus as sort of, anti-ritual or anti-sacrifice in that prophetic way, is that Jesus' direction to go reconcile first with the person you've wronged and then go make your offering is actually just what Leviticus 6 prescribes. That's Leviticus 6. If you've wronged somebody, you first have to reconcile with them. Then you go make your offering. So Jesus' directions are actually just an explication of Leviticus 6, which is actually the point I'm trying to make about the prophets. It's the priests themselves who say, look, there are certain sins for which there's no sacrificial remedy. It's the priests themselves who say, if you've committed this kind of error, don't bring a sacrifice for it. So when the prophets are saying that, they're actually just repeating priestly instruction. But if you've got that erroneous reading and then you sort of force it onto Jesus and Paul, you end up with sort of creating a depiction of Jesus and Paul as anti-ritual and anti-sacrifice or anti-whatever for the sake of some higher good like ethics. When actually the prophets and priests agree with that because they're just repeating the divine instructions. False trope number 3. This trope takes the prophetic ideal, namely the good of justice and mercy, and they take that as like the highest good. And that some scholars then have said that, this ideal, God just wants justice and mercy, over time that degenerated and that devolved into the Jewish people forgetting the prophetic ideal and instead only caring about arcane rituals. So this was actually made probably most famous in, again, the late 18th century and early 19th century. Late 19th century and early 20th century, again, by German scholars who believed that the Jews had basically forsaken their own scriptural ideals and instead had sort of replaced God's desires for their own desires and sort of made the performance of rituals the only important thing. So this is famous, Rudolf Bultmann, famous New Testament scholar of early 20th century in Germany, this was his depiction of New Testament Jews, that they had forsaken what God really wanted and instead had just proliferated all these rules and made them so numerous that no one could keep track of them, and that all they really cared about was rituals that were devoid of ethical meaning. And that's what caused them to miss what God really cared about, which was love and justice and mercy. Again, this particular trope just participates in the error of trope number 2. Which is saying that they sort of degenerated over time into sort of the proliferation of rules. And again, this particular text, this particular trope misses the fact that Jesus himself was someone who said, look, I didn't come to abolish the law. The least of these commandments ought not be nullified. And anyone who teaches that the least of these commandments should be nullified, it's going to be least in the kingdom. It's actually coincidentally not surprising that Rudolf Bultmann thought that text was inauthentic. So he takes Matthew 5, 17 to 20, right, where Jesus says, look, I didn't come to abolish the law, I came to fulfill it. Anyone who nullifies the least of these commandments is least in the kingdom, right? Bultmann said, there's no way Jesus said that. That's an inauthentic tradition. Matthew added that later. You're like, I wonder how you got to that position, right? Like, it's not surprising that you would come to that conviction about Jesus and the law or Jews and the law if there's certain data points that falsify your position that you just say, like, well, that's not real. We can exclude that. False trope number 4. This is, from the laughter earlier, it sounds like you already know this false trope and don't do it. But this is a common one. This is the one I teach undergrads, and this is the one that everyone just assumes. Everyone just assumes that the Jews are legalistic. And they can't imagine a scenario of New Testament reading in which this trope isn't true. But this one's easy at this point, right? This trope, namely that the Jews are legalistic, just commits all the errors of tropes 1, 2, and 3. It fails to realize that the prophets, when they critique ritual or whatever, are not critiquing ritual on the whole. They're just critiquing rituals done as if that would get you out of a mess for which ritual can't get you out of. And instead, I think the basic thing you ought to remember and realize is that, again, Jesus and Paul are both pro-ritual. They both, in Jesus' context, he's prescribing the doing of all of the law. And in Paul, a lot of his own discourse about not needing to circumcise or, that's kind of it, not needing to circumcise, are written predominantly to non-Jewish audiences. Right? So Paul is the apostle to the nations, and he's writing predominantly to non-Jews. So it wouldn't make any sense for Paul to tell Jews who are already circumcised, right? So when do you get circumcised if you're Jewish? The 8th day. What sense would it make to tell Jews who have been circumcised since the 8th day of their life that there's no need to be circumcised? And once you've already got the fact that Paul self-describes as the apostle to the nations, it makes sense that what he's saying is, you Gentiles, you non-Israelites, you don't need to be circumcised to be admitted into this covenant family. Because God's covenant family is not circumscribed or confined to the Jews alone. It's incorporating the nations, the Gentiles. And Paul's point, I think, is more than this, but one of his major points, right, is that you're incorporated as Gentiles. And because you're being incorporated as Gentiles, you don't need to do the things that mark out the Jewish people as the Jewish people. So I think this particular trope commits the errors of tropes 1, 2, and 3, and then applies them both to the Jews of the New Testament period and the Jews of modernity. And it just assumes, this is the deep irony to me, it assumes that Jesus and Paul's critique of their kinsmen was legalism, when their critique is actually the opposite. Jesus' critique is not that his kinsmen are doing the law too rigorously. His critique is that they're not doing the law. Right, this is the irony of a passage like Mark 7, where the Pharisees come to critique Jesus. They say, hey, why don't your disciples follow the traditions of the elders? They don't wash their hands before they eat. And Jesus says, interesting, I'm going to raise the stakes for you. Why do y'all break the law with your traditions? So they accuse Jesus of breaking the traditions. Jesus says, y'all actually use your traditions to break the commandments. And then he just says it like 3 more times. He goes, you guys are great at setting aside the commandment of God in order to honor your traditions. And he says it more times. Same deal with Matthew 23, the famous sort of invective against the Pharisees when he calls them whitewashed tombs, and you guys are all these negative things. You're the ones who were guilty of killing the prophets, etc. In this critique, his critique isn't you're great at doing the law and you're just too scrupulous. His critique is y'all break the law. The irony of this is that his critique of their law breaking is the opposite of the supposed critique of legalism, right? Because what does legalism assume? You guys are doing the law too much. You're too scrupulous with your law keeping. Jesus' critique is literally the opposite. Y'all are lawbreakers. Y'all aren't scrupulous enough, right? It's kind of like the irony here, right? And so once you've taken legalism out of the equation as that which Paul and Jesus are critiquing, it opens the door to seeing that what they're critiquing is their transgression, the fact that they actually aren't law keepers. And then it allows you to position the law as still having sort of a meaningful function within the Jewish scripture, or the Old and New Testament. Now, you'll notice a lot of these have to do with the law. And that's because, unironically, or sort of coincidentally, the law positions itself or functions so meaningfully in all of these tropes. Not just the ones I've named, but lots of them. It's interesting. I'm teaching my undergrads on Matthew 5, on Jesus and the law right now, in a class on Jesus and his teachings. And all I did was put Matthew 5, 17 to 20 in front of them. So Matthew 5, 17 to 20 is the passage where Jesus says, look, I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Anyone who sets aside the least of these commandments will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. And unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you won't enter the kingdom of heaven. All I did was put that text in front of them and say, what is Jesus saying? What's going on? Nothing in this passage has anything to do with Jesus' death or resurrection, has nothing to do with justification, as Paul would describe it, has nothing to do with, you probably heard the phrase, like, the imputed righteousness of Christ, if you've heard that phrase, the fact that we get Christ's righteousness reckoned to us. This passage doesn't say anything about those things, and yet that's what they all went to, because they saw that what was at stake is Jesus saying, you can't enter the kingdom of heaven unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees. And they just assumed, well, that's not possible. There's no way that could be what Jesus actually means, because that's impossible. And all of a sudden, even though all I did was put Matthew 5, 17 and 20 in front of them, all of a sudden they're talking about the meaning of Jesus' death and resurrection and the meaning of 2 Corinthians 5, where Paul talks about the imputed righteousness of Christ. All of a sudden, all these big Christian theological categories were at stake in their minds because I put a passage about the law in front of them. Because what they assumed is, well, if Jesus says it, that your righteousness has to surpass that of the scribes and Pharisees, and if we know, sort of the parenthetical assumption that we all know, if we all know that is not possible, well, then we just have to have Christ's righteousness given to us. The only righteousness that surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees is Jesus's. So that must be Jesus sort of saying that, hey, here's a standard, parentheses, that you can't keep. So when you can't keep it, I'll give you my grace for that sort of thing, right? Again, my point, isn't to say, right, that you have to earn your salvation. My point is simply that it actually misses Jesus' point in this passage, which is that the reason that your righteousness can surpass that of the scribes and Pharisees is why? Christ. Well, because the scribes and Pharisees aren't righteous. They're lawbreakers. It's not, they assumed that the Pharisees and scribes were the super scrupulous law keepers and we could never surpass that, so we'll just do something else. But actually, Jesus' point is, no, the reason that you're able to attain to the righteousness that surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees is because the Pharisees aren't righteous. They're lawbreakers. And so the reason you'll be able to attain to it is because, here's my interpretation of the law that you can keep. I don't think that's controversial, but I know that a lot of readers do think it's controversial, and I'm not saying that you're anti-Semitic if you disagree with me, but a lot of disagreement with it depends upon some of the tropes that just assume that, well, there's no way he thinks law-keeping is possible. You have to ask yourself, why? Why do you think law-keeping is impossible? It is the law itself, remember, go back to trope 1, the law-keeping assumes the commission of transgressions. Like, when God gave the law, he said, look, you're going to commit transgressions, and that's not going to violate the covenant agreement. Jesus himself does this in his own teaching when he says, look, here's the law you got to keep, or here's the instructions that you need to keep, my moral instructions. And we look at them and we're like, man, that's a tall order. Except in the same instructions, the very instructions that he says you must keep in order to keep the kingdom of heaven. In those same instructions, he assumes both divine forgiveness and human forgiveness. Right? Matthew 5 through 7 is a single block of teaching where he says that thing about your righteousness must surpass, right? In that same block of teaching, he says, now here's how you ought to pray. God, please forgive us our transgressions as we forgive each other. And then he tells his disciples, forgive each other because you're going to need it, right? In other words, keeping Jesus' standard of righteousness that surpasses the scribes and Pharisees assumes that you'll be able to procure both divine forgiveness and horizontal forgiveness. And I hope that when you hear me say it, you're like, okay, yeah, that's all there, right? But all of a sudden, you're able to then agree with the fact that there's nothing about Matthew 5 or any other heavy law passages, right, that forces you to commit yourself to tropes 1 through 3. You can just have all that and then have a basically pro-law position, right? And it doesn't, because I know the whole topic is how to read the Bible in ways that aren't anti-Semitic, right? It permits you to read the Bible in a way that doesn't commit you to saying pejorative things about Jews or Judaism. You don't have to commit yourself to saying, oh, they were all legalistic, or they all had like a religion that just like needed to be sort of surpassed, or that the laws God gave them were sort of not really what he really wanted from them. All of a sudden, once you've said that, then you're just Jews who continue to regard this law with sort of high regard, you're just kind of left like, what do you say to them? Okay. I'll keep going for time's sake. False trope number 5. My favorite one. That's not true. They're all great. False trope number 5 is that the Pharisees are legalistic and harsh. Again, the error in this view is it assumes a view that is hardly, if at all, available in the New Testament or other Jewish texts. The Pharisees are not overly strict. This is the wild one. Maybe Seth talked about it on the Second Temple Judaism one. I don't know. They were regarded by all of their contemporaries, right? So did Seth talk about the Sadducees and Pharisees and other groups, yeah, right? So there's Sadducees, there's Pharisees, there's Essenes, there's Jesus followers, right? Yeah. The unanimous depiction of the Pharisees among all these groups was that they were the lenient ones. The Sadducees thought, you guys are just making stuff up to make the law easier. That's what the Sadducees said. The Sadducees said, look, we only follow the written laws. And the written law says if any carcass falls into your drink, it's impure. Well, can you guys think of any carcasses that might regularly fall in your drink? You can actually, because you're thinking, you're hearing the word carcass and thinking like a dead cow. Gnats! What if a gnat falls in your drink? What if you're a winemaker and you've got a vat of wine this big, costs $1,000, and a single gnat falls into it? Is that it? You just got to throw all that out now? The Pharisees read that law and said, well, that's intense. It's got to be at least the size of a fly. Or bigger. They called it the lintel rule. It's got to be the size of a lintel. And also, it only has to be wine that you're dedicating to the temple. If it's just like common wine that you're going to drink at home, it's fine. It's fine. So what would you do then if you had this conviction, right? What would you do then if a gnat fell into your drink? Make it common wine, or if it doesn't actually mess with your drink, what might you do? Strain it.
So do the Gentiles.
Yeah, that. All of a sudden now you're hearing Jesus' phrasing, right? You guys strain a gnat, but you swallow a camel. Right? This is where Jesus gets that phrase, because he knows of the Pharisaic ruling that they strain gnats out of their wine. They don't regard it as actually qualifying one of the transgressions that Leviticus 11 names, or not transgression, but whatever, regulations. So, in other words, you have to think, though, about what they've done. They've made the law that is almost impossible to live by if gnats exist, and have said, okay, it's got to be a lintel or bigger. Pharisees are the lenient ones here. The Essenes said, nope, y'all are too lenient. Sadducees said, nope, that's a tradition. The written law says what it says. Like the almost ubiquitous, almost unanimous conviction of contemporary Jews, Essenes, Sadducees, Jesus followers, was that the Pharisees were lenient. And in fact, I put a text here for you. You can see it. Look at 5b. This is a quotation of Josephus, Jewish Roman historian. I've excerpted it, obviously, so you can get the broader context, but you can see the point. He says this of the Pharisees, that indeed the Pharisees, even upon other occasions, are not apt to be severe in punishments. They're talking about someone who transgressed in a way that basically deserved death. And they said, don't do that. Just give them the synagogue lashing. Now, that still sounds intense to us, right? The synagogue lashing, 39 lashes. I think we'd all prefer that to death, though, right? And Josephus commenting on this says, the Pharisees were not apt to be strict or severe in punishments. And then the next text you see is from Damascus document, which is a group, probably the Essenes, who wrote some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, in my opinion. Damascus document 118. I think it's probably referring to the Pharisees. It's a bigger argument, but he says, they sought easy interpretations. They chose illusions, and they scrutinized loopholes. So notice, what a lot of texts say of the Pharisees is that they are the strictest readers of the law. But a strict reader of the law doesn't mean he comes up with a strict interpretation. Someone who reads something really closely might be someone who's trying to be like, let me just really play with the words here and see what I can get out of this. Not to transgress the law, but to make life livable. Because again, if you've got the gnat in your wine drink, then you just can't drink outside, ever. Or possibly even inside. And so they made the law livable. My point is that most of our contemporary evidence does not depict the Pharisees as legalistic or harsh. Contrary, they were popular with the masses because they made life livable because of their generous interpretations of the laws. Now, important to recognize, Jesus still had critiques of them. And I'm not saying that he didn't have anything to critique of them. He critiqued them, but precisely not on their legalism. Again, critique them for their transgression. Again, this actually positions Jesus as the strict one. Looking at the Pharisees' practice and be like, guys, y'all are being a little too loose with that. And he regards them as transgressive. So again, if you're committed to reading the New Testament and particularly the depictions of Jesus in the Gospels, you're committed to reading Jesus as agreeing with the fact that the Pharisees are not too harsh, but are actually too lenient, and that Jesus thinks they're transgressive. Also, on top of it, is that aside from just the bare historical point, which I think is important enough if you want to read texts well, which I assume you do, or you wouldn't be here on a Wednesday night. I have 3 kids. I have a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 1-year-old. I don't know what month it is. I don't. The other day, I tried to pay for something. I gave them my credit card. And they were like, this is expired. And I looked at it, and I think it was October. It said, we're in 2024? This is actually the point. It was in April. It said this expired, and I looked, and I was like, I was paying for it in April. I was like, come on, it's April. It doesn't expire in April. She goes, sir, this says April 2023. And I was like, that still didn't do it for me. I was like, I turned to my buddy, I was like, what year are we in? Thanks. All this is to say, sorry, it's not just the point that I want you to get to the bare historical point. It's also that you probably heard people use Pharisees as a slur. That's so pharisaical, or you're a Pharisee. The problem with this is, it's also just wrong. Because what they typically mean is someone who's a Pharisee is someone who's like too much cares about the rules, when, again, ironically, the Pharisees were the ones who were being generous with the rules so that they can make life livable. So it's already historically wrong. But also on top of it, what we've done is we've used a label that refers to real people, Jews, to use it as a slur, such that you're then using a word that refers to real people as a slur. And I'm sure, again, if you're here at this kind of event, you all probably know Jews and Jewish teachers, and it's incredibly offensive to them. Because you're like, that's us, man. It's not us, but it's us, And so you might as well be using Jew as a slur, right? This is often how a lot of them take it. So lots of good reasons to avoid this trope. And it will help you both in your reading of the New Testament and to avoid reading your Bible in a way that is anti-Semitic. Okay, penultimate trope, number 6. The position is that the Jews never mix with Gentiles. Obviously historically wrong. The error is that, right, a lot of cultures tend to, quote, sit with their own. That's pretty basic to a lot of cultures. But for some reason, whenever we read ancient texts and then apply that fact to Jews, we think, oh, well, that's just because they're xenophobic, or they don't like outsiders. And you're like, first of all, no, I don't think that's true. But also, B, everybody tends to sit with their own. That's just kind of human nature. Right or wrong, that's kind of just human nature. You gravitate toward people who are like yourself, whether it's culturally or ethnically or whatever. Lots of different categories that could fit in there. So it's basically a double standard. We're okay with it when we do it, but all of a sudden when we read a text about Jews not doing that, we're thinking, well, that's because they were xenophobic or they didn't like outsiders. And also it's just wrong. They could and did eat with Gentiles. The only thing that they had to be careful about, of course, was that the food that they ate wasn't against their own law, right? So if you're going to eat with Jews, you don't serve them pork. But also note that that's just a matter of good hospitality. That's not them being weird. And also what they had to be worried about, particularly in the ancient setting, is that the meal hadn't been offered to another deity. All right, so in a polytheistic culture where everyone's got their own god or 1,000 different gods or whatever, right? Or a city's got its own cultic practices. They had to be cautious that the meal that they ate at hadn't been dedicated to another deity. So that's what they had to worry about. Those things provided, if they could be ensured that the food was not pork, hypothetically, and hadn't been offered to another deity, they could eat with you. There was no risk in eating with a Gentile. They did it. We know they did it. We have the texts that talk about it. So this, again, will help you read certain New Testament passages better I think that will come up in the Q&A, so I'll wait for it for time. And finally, the last one that is a bit easy, the false trope number 7 is the position that their laws are so exotic. What this tends to do is to look at the foreignness of their laws, foreignness to us, and think, wow, that foreignness means that these laws are weird. And again, what that tends to do is to then read, Old Testament's got weird laws, it progresses toward non-weird laws. Again, the error it commits is interpreting foreignness, i.e. foreignness to you, as weird. When, again, every culture has its own idiosyncratic regulations that look weird to others, right? Imagine trying to explain to an ancient Israelite why you drag a dead tree into your house and stuff socks with presents to celebrate the birth of Israel's Messiah. They'd be like, "You're doing what? Why?" You'd have to explain a lot, and I don't even know why we do it. But that's just because everyone's regulations, from the point of view of an outsider, look weird to the other person, right? So when we do it, though, when we look back at these Old Testament laws, we're like, those are weird. What you tend to do is not only exoticize them pejoratively, like make them seem weird, you also then, you have like it's easy to then to read it as like sort of a progressive ideal that we got less weird over time. So that by the time you get to the New Testament, Jesus sort of just like left all the weird stuff behind and just got to the kernel of it, right? But what you've done then is you've, again, committed this trope that participates in reading Israel's own customs as weird and wrong that Jesus dispensed with. So I'll conclude then just with some I think, better starting points. These have kind of already been implicit in some of the tropes. And I don't, it's okay. I don't agree. I don't assume that you'll all agree with me. That's fine. We can talk about that. So I think a better starting point is that to realize that neither Jesus nor Paul abrogated the law for Israel. Jesus kept the law, taught others to, and didn't nullify anything. Gave some examples there about what I think is actually going on in some of the texts that people take the other way. But I don't think in Mark 7 Jesus nullifies the food laws. I don't think in Acts 10, Peter's vision, that has anything to do with the nullifying of the food laws. That's about the cleansing of the Gentiles. And then again, you have to recall for Paul's letters, he's writing to predominantly Gentiles. So in point B there, Paul's derogatory comments on circumcision pertain exclusively to Gentiles who think that, well, if I get circumcised, then I'm in. And he's saying, no, you're already in. You don't need to circumcise. And then I think point C there that I think Paul's other seemingly critical comments on the law actually just pertain to the law's incapacity to resurrect dead humans, right? So he thinks that we're all mortal and frail and basically necrotic, dying. And he says, look, this is Galatians 3:21. If the law could resurrect you, then yeah, righteousness would be from the law. This is an odd phrase. It's in Galatians 3:21. That's a quote of Galatians 3:21. If the law could resurrect you, then righteousness would be through the law. But the implicit point is, but the law can't resurrect you, so that's why it's not. In other words, he assumes that the plight is our mortality, and the law is not a solution to our mortality. The law can band-aid our mortality. It cannot make you immortal. So that's, and immortality is what you need because you're going to be in the presence of God. You've got to be able to endure it. And point D, I think actually, I don't expect you all to just believe me right off the bat here, but I think point D is true, that Paul was probably law observant and that expected other believing Jews to continue law observance. Because I know that's the one probably most people have trouble with, I put the text there for you. This is from Acts. So notice this text from Acts where Paul shows up in Jerusalem and James and others show up and they say, this is what they say. You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who've believed. They're all zealous for the law. They've been told about you that you're teaching all the Jews. So here's what they've been told. That you, Paul, are teaching all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses. That you've been telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to the customs. What then is to be done? They'll hear that you've come, so here, do what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take them, purify yourself along with them, pay their expenses so that you may shave their heads. And look at the italics. And in doing this, all will know that there is nothing to the things which they've been told about you. And then all will know that you yourself also walk orderly, keeping the law. And then skip down to verse 26. Paul did it. He took them in, next day, purified himself, etc. In other words, in agreeing to do what he said, he agreed to the effect of what those actions would signal, namely that he's a law keeper and isn't saying anything about Jewish law keeping. I'll skip number 2. You can read it, but we've already talked about it. Actually, no, there's a second part that's important about it. If you've got Jesus and Paul's critique as transgression, because right earlier I said, look, his critique isn't legalism, it's transgression, etc. Then a lot of people would say, well, come on, that's still a critique. Like, that's still bad, right? Isn't that anti-Semitic? And so that's the important point here is to recognize. Notice, This is an intramural critique. And we all know the qualitative difference between insiders critiquing insiders, on the one hand, over against outsiders critiquing insiders. Right? You can imagine cultural in-groups saying things to each other like, hey, come on, you're better than that. These are the ideals that we all agree with. Rise up to them, right? That's very different than me looking at you guys. Like, for example, I don't know you guys, right? I just met you guys tonight. What if I came here and started critiquing you guys and critiquing your practices? You'd be like, who are you? And you'd be right in doing that, right? If I showed up and I just started critiquing you and criticizing you and saying all these things you've done wrong, you'd be like, what y'all would do is you'd turn to Meredith and be like, Meredith, who is this guy? But if you and I know each other, and you and I have ideals that you and I have already agreed on and lived on our whole life, and then you fail to them, and I'm like, look, man, I know you, you know me. This is not what we're about. That's a very different criticism, and that's what you have in the New Testament. Jesus critiquing his kinsmen is an insider critiquing other insiders. Once that gets in the hands of a predominantly Gentile church, us, if not all of us in the room, it becomes outsiders reading a text of insiders critiquing insiders. But if you miss the insiders critiquing insiders aspect, it becomes a predominantly Gentile church critiquing Jews. And that's a very different situation that often then participates in basically tropes 1 through 7. Yeah. Last one. From a historical point of view, I'm a Christian. I love the word Christianity, okay? So don't misread me. I love the word Christianity. I'm a Christian. But from a historical point of view, from the New Testament, Paul and Jesus aren't starting something new called Christianity with a distinct pattern of religion over against Judaism. Jesus and Paul are starting and heralding a renewal movement, a restoration movement. They're executing or heralding the restoration of Israel from all the plights that they're experiencing from the Old Testament because of their break of the covenant. And now, at their point in history, the nations are flocking to God, such that the people of God are now Israel, restored Israel, and the nations that are now joining them. And Paul sees that happening in his own time, right? He's the apostle to the nations. Taking that will help us from talking pejoratively about Judaism over against our religion called Christianity. Because from Paul's point of view, it's just a covenant renewal movement that we are participants in. And it reminds us that us as the nations, again, this is actually the really important point, it's Paul's own point in Romans 11. We're the latecomers. We're the wild branches that got grafted in at the last moment. The last moment that lasted 2,000 years. Right, the last moment. Right? So we're the wild branches that got grafted in. And again, this helps us to think about the kind of covenantal relationship that we're joining. And it helps us not speak pejoratively about an old pattern of religion called Judaism that has been replaced with something new called Christianity. Okay, we've got some time, I hope, for, over 20 minutes for questions. So thanks very much for your attention, and I hope that made sense. But please, anything, how do y'all do? Do y'all just start asking questions, Meredith?
Yeah, we do. I got a question. How do you interpret, and you said a lot about it speaking primarily to Gentiles, but there were also some Jews in these congregations. Do you interpret the Romans 7 line about being dead to the law as directed primarily at Gentile Christians or as Jewish Christians?
Yeah, great question, because though I think that Paul is writing to predominantly Gentiles, that doesn't preclude him from saying things about Jews. Clearly he does, right? He does in Romans 2 and 3 and 4, and he does in Romans 9 through 11, obviously, and in 1 Thessalonians 2 and 2 Corinthians 3. The difference there is Paul is, I think, speaking paradigmatically about his own experience with the law before his pre-Christian experience. I don't think Romans 7 is describing the Christian experience. I think it's describing the Paul's pre-conversion experience of the law. And he's describing the fact that when he encountered the law, it told him not to covet, but the law didn't equip him not to covet. So the law told him not to covet, that's good, but the law didn't equip him to not covet. And so what the law did was it exacerbated his sinful flesh tendencies. So when he says that we are separated or nullified from the law, I think he's talking about, because later in Romans 7 he talks about the law of sin and death, by which he means the law that's been entangled with sin that results in your death. And he distinguishes that in Romans 7. He distinguishes that from in Romans 8:2, right? This is actually a great one because like what freed you from the law of sin and death? What did? What freed you from the law of sin and death? That's what everyone right wants to say. Understandably. No. Paul says the law did. Romans 8:2. The law of spirit and life freed you from the law of sin and death. The law is the subject of the verb freed you in Romans 8:2. And that's not even just my weird idiosyncratic translation. That's, you just open up any of your Bibles. That's Romans 8:2. The law of spirit and life freed you from the law.
Where's the law come
From
define law?
the law of Moses. The law
of
God,
Moses.
yeah, the law God gave to Moses. And so then he says that the law became entangled with sin, which exacerbated your fleshly tendencies.
God gave Moses 10 commandments. So then
Yeah.
after that, the Jews then started building and creating the law. Is that correct?
No, God gave them Leviticus. God gave them the rest of Deuteronomy. Everything that's in Deuteronomy, Leviticus, Exodus, Numbers is divinely prescribed.
That's the law.
Yeah.
I don't know that part very well.
Okay, no, that's okay. That's okay. That's the opening of Leviticus is, and God called to Moses, and then Moses goes in the tabernacle, and God says, "Here you go." Right. So the point is, in your question, go back to your question though, the notion that,
He's using two different,
yeah. So what you were freed from was the law of sin and death.
which was
The law.
put into the Mosaic law, but then cut off from the Mosaic law, so now there's this new law.
There's a law of spirit and life, and it's not clear from Paul alone whether the commandments are coterminous, like are identical. The reason that I think that you have license to say that they are identical is because in Romans 7, he says, hey, the law said don't covet, but the law itself couldn't equip you for that.
Sure,
And then in Romans 13, he quotes the do not covet command as something you ought to be keeping.
sure. So then why was it so important for, if they're, okay, totally sympathetic with the law is entirely positive, why was it so important for the Gentiles to not
Yeah,
follow the law? Like why?
Really good
it wasn't-
question.
It wasn't just like, do this, you don't have to do it. It was, if
yeah,
you
don't do it. You do it, you're toast. Yeah, you're toast, yeah.
What was your salvation? So what was dangerous about the law for the Gentiles then?
Yeah, really good question. So I'll repeat it for the folks on Zoom in case. It's not just that Paul thinks like you don't need to, it's don't do it. So here's the why. So he says in Galatians 2, he says, right, this is the Antioch incident when he's recounting his telling off of Peter at Antioch because Peter had been eating with Gentiles, and then when some men from James showed up, Peter became fearful and he withdrew and he separated. And so then Paul addresses Peter. He says, Peter, if you were living Gentilishly, how do you compel the Gentiles to Judaize? So that's the important language there. How is it that you could possibly compel the Gentiles to Judaize? In other words, the word Judaize is a common morpheme, a common way to form a word in Greek to refer to adopting the customs of another nation to become that nation. Right? So we actually still have the word. So if someone was born in another country and then they moved here and then they've kind of grown up in our customs, how would you describe that person? Naturalized or Americanized, right? Same deal. So importantly, that means that Jews cannot Judaize, right? Jews are already Jews. The only people who can Judaize are non-Jews. And so he says, Peter, how is it that you could possibly compelling these Gentiles to Judaize? In other words, how could you compel them to become Jews by adopting Jewish customs? And the same deal, if a Jew wanted to become more like a Greek, the Jew would adopt Greek customs and he would Hellenize. Or if a Greek person wanted to adopt Roman customs, he would Romanize. So same. Now the notion is that the reason that, to go back to your original question, why ought not they? Because what is God's promise to Abraham?
It was a blessing of the nations.
In you I will bless all the nations.
They're not nations anymore if
They are not nations anymore if
they
they Judaize. And it's precisely the legal logic of Paul's reasoning. God cannot keep his promise. If all the nations Judaize, the promise is nullified. This is why I say this by grace through faith, so that the promise can be secured for all of Abraham's descendants. Gentiles Judaize, they become Jews. God cannot keep the promise. And that's actually why he calls it, what does he call it? A false gospel. Because he says in Galatians 3, 7, and 8, the gospel was preached ahead of time to Abraham that in you all the nations will be blessed. So it's a false gospel if you require all the nations to Judaize. Because what does it do? What does it say about God? If you got to Judaize to be part of God's people, what does it say about God?
Liar.
Yeah, yes, liar. He hasn't keeping his promise. But if you've got to become a Jew to be a member of the people of God,
That's a law.
That's almost like with the Greek gods and stuff like that. A deity.
yes, sorry, we're saying?
Nullifies the nations.
Nullifies the nations, and it means that God is only the God of Jews. It limits him. It compromises. He's not the one God of the world. He's not the one God of all. In fact, this is, if you have a Bible out here, Romans 3:28. We reckon that a person is justified by faith apart from works of the law, or is God the God of the Jews only? Is he not also the God of the nations? Yes, the God of the nations also. Therefore, he will justify the circumcision and the foreskin by faith. If Gentiles are required to Judaize, it compromises the oneness of God. He is not the God of all nations if all nations have to Judaize. So it's both a horizontal sociological thing, right? Gentiles don't need to Judaize, and it's a theological thing. If you got to Judaize to become part of this people, then God's only the God of the Jews. He's not actually the creator. He's not actually the God of all nations. And he actually hasn't rescued all nations.
Paul, fast forward 2,000 years, and we are now in America in the melting pot.
Yep.
And obviously this is all from the perspective of as we read the Bible, that we're cognizant of potential pitfalls.
Mm-hmm.
What about our country? How our country is treating the Jewish people, or some people in our country are treating the Jewish people.
So just like my evaluation of that, or how the New Testament evaluate that, bad. For a few reasons. One, just because you ought not treat any people group that way, and also, yes, because that's probably a sufficient answer. That you ought not treat any people group pejoratively or racistly, if that's what's happening. But then in particular, I do think that there is a rise of anti-Semitism, both in certain, not all, but in certain university campuses around the world, around the nation, but also globally. And of course, there's going to be the reactions to the October 7th attack. So I think the mistake the error that people can make is that I think you ought to support Jewish people and ought not be anti-Semitic. That's not the same thing as agreeing with all of the military policies of the IDF. I'm not a military specialist or a political specialist, so I truly cannot and should not comment on that. I just would simply say that those are category mistakes. You can say, I support the Jews and Jewish people, and equally not say, I support every military policy of the IDF, in the same way that you say that about Americans. I can't imagine that I...
Will say that about themselves.
Exactly, and I would say it about our own military. I can't say that I don't. First of all, I don't have the capacity, but also I'm assuming our military has performed things that are probably morally wrong, just in our global history. But but that's not the same thing as saying Americans need to be punished or die for this.
So when you refer to nations, again, that was
Yes.
thousands of years ago before the type of travel and stuff. Would we be considered a nation?
Yes. We're part of the non-Israelite collective called the nations. Because what they did was everybody's a nation, it's not them.
Okay.
So it's Israel and the nations.
Nations.
Yep.
Tribes.
Yep, tribes, people groups, yep. Tongues, yep.
So let me ask a question about Paul. I'm just curious if I understand, or if I have a better understanding of this. What did Paul require the Jewish people? Did he require them to recognize Christ as the Savior?
That is my reading of Romans 9 through 11, yes. That I think that his reading of, yes, my reading of Romans 9 to 11 is that Paul expected Jews to acknowledge their Messiah as the divinely appointed rescuer of both Israel and the nations.
And how, with your reading of that, to what end? In other words, if Gentiles accept Christ, the mystery notwithstanding and
Yep.
everything, Jews who had clearly, I'd say, a different tradition, obviously they were that's the seed or the root. What exactly did Jesus do for them that it did for Gentiles, if you will?
So I would say that what Jesus did, he did for everyone who accepts it. And he did it primarily, and chronologically primarily, for Israel. Because they were in a state of, they were still experiencing the punitive discipline that had fallen upon them as a result of their prior breach of the covenant. So in Deuteronomy 28 through 30, you get a description of all the punitive discipline that will fall upon Israel if they violate the covenant. A lot of Jews of Jesus' period, Jesus including, believed that Israel was still experiencing that punitive discipline, and that his death and resurrection rescued his people out of it. Yeah, and that then after his resurrection, he tells his disciples to go tell the Jews again about this, and of course then go outward to the nations.
And the Jews don't have a Holy Spirit like Jesus promised us.
The Holy Spirit seems to be poured out on all those who believe, Jewish or Gentile. So I wouldn't say the Jews don't. I'd say non-believing Jews. The New Testament would say that the Spirit is poured out on all believers, Jewish and Gentile. Yep.
I had a question over here.
Oh, excuse me. Yes.
Yeah. What are your thoughts, I guess, in light of false trope number 6 on maybe some of the teachings we've heard about the Samaritans and that relationship, and maybe just reconciling that? Is that overblown, or is that just what are your thoughts?
Yes. Okay.
Not make that false trope.
Really good question. I'm going to restate it
Okay.
to make sure I've understood, or in case you just want to clarify. So you're asking particularly like how do the Samaritans fit in with this Jew-Gentile trope?
Well, and just how do you not have it in a way that I might say is, that lends itself to anti-Semitism in any way that I think about approaching that
Yeah.
story, or the parables about it, or
Yeah.
otherwise.
Good question. Okay, so the question is for any folks on Zoom. Is there anybody on Zoom? No. Okay. So Samaritans were
Oh, is there,
I
joined and I left.
they regarded themselves as members of the northern kingdom of Israel. Jews did not agree with that estimation. So Jews refers to members of the southern kingdom of Judah. So if you're a Judaios, that means you're a member of the southern kingdom of Judah. Samaritans self-regarded as members of the northern kingdom and thus Israelites. Jews largely, one of my favorite quotes is, Judaism doesn't teach anything, Jews do. All right, because you're like, when you're talking about particularly ancient evidence, you're like, well, depends on who you ask. But a lot of Jews thought that the Samaritans' self-description as Israelites was wrong. But they did, a lot of them, this is going to use sort of, now it's frowned upon ethnic language, but they would call them half Israelites or half Jews or half something, right? Because they're like, okay, you've got a claim, but it's questionable, right? That sort of thing. There was animosity, so that's not wrong. There was extreme animosity between Jews and Samaritans. I think it can be overplayed. There's plenty of evidence of just sort of get along and just live and let live sort of idea. But there was animosity for sure with Samaritans. For example, they knew that the Jews kept Passover at a certain time, and they knew they had to keep the festival in a state of purity. And so there's a record of Samaritans in the middle of the night going to the Jerusalem temple and throwing human bones everywhere, because then that would render everyone impure, and it would make them incapable of keeping, right? So that's like very bad pranking, right? I mean, it's like that's so there was animosity, and Jesus himself actually, the interesting thing about the parable of the Good Samaritan is it actually participates in the estimation, right? Because the whole reason it's shocking that the Samaritan is the one that's good is because he can rely on the supposition that, yeah, we all know the Samaritans aren't usually the good ones, right? And yet, he, by both supposing that trope and also sort of saying, look, but the Samaritan was the one who did the right thing, it works to include someone who was formerly excluded if that person does mercy, right? Did that answer your question? Okay.
Okay, we've only got 3 minutes. Will we take a whole list of questions? The first, I'm not gonna read them all because they're like 20 of them. We've got 3 minutes. But some of the ones that I think we're not gonna hit in the next 2 weeks. One of you asked, are Jewish people going to heaven? Are they still the chosen people?
Paul, so I don't know. So Paul, I mean, I hope will I go to heaven? I don't know. The way that Paul, I think, answers this question is that all people need to accept Christ. I think Paul thinks that Jews will accept Christ. It's the difficulty with a text like Romans 11 is that he just doesn't give any details about it, right? It's just, you probably know the text, right? When Christ returns, all Israel will be saved. Does he mean all of them alive at the time, all of them throughout history, or all in the generic sense of like a lot? I don't know. I do think, though, that Paul thinks that Jews need to. Whether he thinks they all will or won't, I don't know. They are still the chosen people, but being chosen never keeps one from punishment. That's right. They get exiled. So, yeah.
One more question, because now we have 2 minutes. Why was sacrifice a necessary part of Judaism for so long? And what do we think of that in terms of modern concepts of animal abuse?
Sacrifice was a common part of ancient Near Eastern religion across the board. So Jews were not idiosyncratic in this at all. This was just what everybody did. And important to recognize is that the point of it was not to punish the animal over against someone else who deserved punishment. The blood from the animal was procured in order to splash onto the altars to purify the altars, because the commission of sin had defiled the altars. And the reason that's bad is because God dwells in that sacred space. So if God dwells in that sacred space, don't defile that sacred space. Solution, sprinkle the blood on the altar to purify it. The reason given in Leviticus 17, 10 and 11 is that there is life in the blood, and blood atones by virtue of the life that's in it. And I think we're committed to thinking it's not weird because we also think that that's what Jesus' blood did, was purify. So if you call that weird, then okay. Why they still don't is because they don't have a temple anymore. Oh, why it's not animal abuse. I'm sure that's completely subjective. I'm sure a lot of people would call it animal abuse. If you've called it a divine right by which you receive some sort of really high good, like, right, I mean, a lot of us ate meat tonight to satisfy temporary hunger, which is presumably a lesser good than divine forgiveness, and a lot more animals had to die than the one. So, like, if we're committed to animal sacrifice as animal abuse, then, right, eating meat at all is animal abuse, right? So I'm not convinced by the evaluation, but it's subjective evaluation. I mean, people can call it animal abuse, and I suppose they can make an argument. But if you think it's a divinely prescribed right, then I wouldn't call it animal abuse. Yeah. In fact, actually, though, he importantly says you may not. In fact, no, this is important because God in Leviticus does say you cannot use blood however you like, and you can't just slaughter animals anytime you want. If you slaughter an animal, it better be for sacrifice. and that alone. And then eventually he gives them the right to slaughter for the sake of eating food. But it's a concession. It's a concession. So, I mean, it seems that sacrifice is actually intended to limit quite extensively their use of animals. And there is a prolonged prohibition against consumption of blood that goes back to the Leviticus 17:10, 11, like blood belongs to God because it's the vehicle of life. That belongs to God. Don't mess with it. Animal blood, human blood, don't mess with it. So I think there's actually a way back into the window of like, no, actually, this is part of God's care for creation, not his abuse of it. But thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate it.